In the shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where towering pines whisper secrets that the wind carries but never tells, there stands an empty lot where once a cabin bore witness to events so disturbing that decades later, investigators still refuse to speak openly about what they discovered. The year was 1981, and in the small resort community of Keddie, California, a family tragedy would unfold that would challenge every assumption about safety, trust, and the darkness that can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. What happened in Cabin 28 would become one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a case so disturbing that crucial evidence would mysteriously vanish, witnesses would disappear, and the truth would be buried beneath layers of silence and fear. The mountain community of Keddie existed as a forgotten remnant of California's logging boom, a collection of weathered cabins nestled in the forest where families with nowhere else to go could find affordable shelter and a chance to start over. The Keddie Resort had once been a destination for vacationers seeking escape from city life, but by 1981 it had transformed into something entirely different, a place where broken families and desperate people gathered in the shadows of towering trees that seemed to watch and remember everything. Cabin 28 sat among a cluster of similar structures, each one a small universe of human struggles and dreams deferred. The cabins were close enough that neighbors could hear conversations through thin walls, yet far enough apart that screams might go unnoticed in the darkness of a mountain night. The forest pressed close around the settlement, creating a sense of isolation that could feel either protective or threatening, depending on one's state of mind and circumstances. Glenna Sharp had arrived in Keddie with her 5 children, seeking refuge from a life that had become impossible elsewhere. She was a woman who carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that single mothers develop when survival becomes their daily reality. Her children ranged from young to teenage, each one carrying their own burdens and hopes as they tried to build something resembling stability in their small mountain sanctuary. The Sharp family had been living in Cabin 28 for several months by April 1981, long enough to establish routines and relationships within the small community, yet recent enough that they still felt like newcomers in a place where everyone seemed to be running from something. Glenna worked multiple jobs to support her family, often leaving the older children to care for the younger ones, a responsibility that created bonds of loyalty and protection that would prove crucial to understanding the events that followed. The community of Keddie operated according to unwritten rules of mutual respect and deliberate ignorance of each other's business. People came to the mountains to escape their pasts, and the implicit understanding was that questions about backgrounds and circumstances were unwelcome. This culture of privacy and non-interference created an environment where both healing and danger could flourish undetected. The evening of April 11, 1981, began like many others in the Sharp household, with the familiar rhythms of family life playing out in the confined space of their cabin. The older children had made plans to spend the night with friends, leaving the younger ones at home with their mother. The arrangements were typical of the informal childcare networks that developed in communities like Keddie, where families relied on each other for support and companionship. As darkness settled over the mountain community, and the sounds of normal evening activities faded into the whisper of wind through pine trees, something began to unfold in Cabin 28 that would shatter the fragile peace of the entire community. The events of that night would remain largely unknown until the following morning, when the discovery of what had occurred would send shockwaves through law enforcement agencies and create a mystery that would haunt investigators for decades. The morning of April 12th brought with it the kind of crystal-clear mountain air that typically promised a beautiful day, but for the residents of Keddie, it would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would never truly end. The discovery at Cabin 28 was made by one of the Sharp children returning from their sleepover, expecting to find a normal family morning, but instead encountering a scene that would be burned into their memory forever. What the authorities found when they arrived at Cabin 28 defied every assumption they had about crime in small mountain communities. The scene suggested a level of violence and brutality that seemed impossible in a place where people came seeking peace and escape from urban dangers. The physical evidence told a story of terror and desperation that challenged the investigators' understanding of human nature and criminal behavior. The initial investigation revealed that 3 members of the Sharp family had lost their lives during the night. while others had somehow survived or escaped the carnage. The positioning of the victims and the nature of their injuries suggested that whatever had occurred had been personal, prolonged and conducted by individuals who knew the family and their routines well enough to plan and execute their attack with calculated precision. Detective Doug Thomas of the Plumas County Sheriff's Office was among the first law enforcement officials to examine the scene, and his initial observations would prove crucial to understanding both what had happened and why the case would become so frustratingly difficult to solve. Thomas noted immediately that the crime scene showed evidence of careful planning and intimate knowledge of the victim's habits and living arrangements. The detective's examination of the cabin revealed signs of struggle that extended throughout the small living space, suggesting that the victims had fought desperately for their lives while their attackers pursued them through the confined quarters with methodical determination. The evidence indicated that the perpetrators had spent considerable time in the cabin, both before and after the main events, possibly searching for something specific or simply savoring their actions. Most disturbing to Detective Thomas was the realization that the attack had occurred while other family members were sleeping in nearby rooms, raising questions about how such violence could unfold without waking the entire household. The acoustics of the small cabin and the proximity of the bedrooms suggested that either the sleeping family members had been drugged or incapacitated, or the attackers possessed knowledge that enabled them to conduct their business without alerting potential witnesses. The investigation also revealed that one member of the Sharp family was missing entirely, with no trace of their whereabouts or fate. This disappearance added another layer of mystery to an already complex case, as investigators struggled to determine whether the missing person was a victim who had been taken elsewhere, a witness who had fled in terror, or possibly even someone connected to the perpetrators. The missing family member's absence created a gap in the investigators' understanding of events that would prove impossible to fill through physical evidence alone. Without witness testimony or a body to examine, Detective Thomas and his colleagues were forced to reconstruct the night's events through forensic analysis and speculation, a process that left crucial questions unanswered and opened the door for multiple theories about what had actually occurred. The forensic examination of Cabin 28 revealed evidence that suggested the attackers had possessed detailed knowledge of the family's routines and living arrangements. The timing of the attack, the specific targeting of certain family members while others remained undisturbed, and the apparent ease with which the perpetrators had gained entry all pointed to inside knowledge that could only have come from someone familiar with the household. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the forensic pathologist assigned to examine the victims, noted several unusual aspects of the case that distinguished it from typical violent crimes. The pattern of injuries suggested that the attack had been conducted with both methodical planning and explosive rage, a combination that indicated personal motivation rather than random criminal activity or simple robbery gone wrong. The pathologist's analysis also revealed that the victims had endured their ordeal for an extended period, suggesting that their attackers had taken time to inflict suffering beyond what was necessary to accomplish their apparent goals. This prolonged nature of the attack indicated either sadistic pleasure-seeking or an attempt to extract information or cooperation from the victims before ending their lives. The investigation into the Sharp family's background and relationships within the Keddie community revealed a complex web of connections and conflicts that provided multiple potential motives for the attack. The family's relatively recent arrival in the community, combined with their interactions with various neighbors and acquaintances, had created situations that could have generated resentment, jealousy, or other emotions capable of escalating to violence. Detective Thomas's interviews with community members revealed that the Sharp family had become involved in several disputes and relationships that had created tension within the small, close-knit population of Keddie. These conflicts ranged from minor disagreements about property boundaries and noise complaints to more serious issues involving romantic relationships and financial obligations that had strained the informal social networks that held the community together. The detective's investigation also uncovered evidence that some residents of Keddie had backgrounds and connections that extended far beyond the peaceful mountain community. Several individuals had connections to criminal organizations and activities that brought elements of danger and violence into what was supposed to be a safe haven for families seeking escape from urban problems. The revelation that Keddie harbored individuals with criminal connections opened new avenues of investigation, but also created additional complications for law enforcement. The community's culture of privacy and non-interference made residents reluctant to provide information about their neighbors, even when that information might be crucial to solving a multiple murder case. As the investigation progressed, Detective Thomas began to suspect that the Sharp family murders were not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of criminal activity that had been operating undetected within the mountain community. The sophistication of the attack, the apparent inside knowledge possessed by the perpetrators, and the community's resistance to providing information all suggested connections to organized criminal elements. The detectives' suspicions were reinforced when the investigation revealed evidence of drug trafficking and other illegal activities that had been conducted through networks extending throughout the Sierra Nevada region. These criminal operations relied on the isolation and privacy of mountain communities like Keddie to conduct business away from law enforcement scrutiny, creating an environment where violence could be used to resolve disputes or eliminate perceived threats. The discovery of the criminal networks operating in and around Keddie transformed the Sharp family murder investigation from a local crime into a complex case with implications that extended throughout Northern California. Detective Thomas found himself dealing not only with local suspects and motives, but also with the possibility that the murders had been committed as part of larger criminal enterprises that possessed resources and connections capable of obstructing justice. The expanded scope of the investigation brought additional law enforcement agencies into the case, including state and federal authorities with experience in organized crime and drug trafficking. However, the involvement of multiple agencies also created coordination challenges and jurisdictional disputes that complicated the pursuit of suspects and evidence. As months passed without arrests or resolution, the Sharp family murder case began to take on aspects that went beyond ordinary criminal investigation. Evidence began disappearing from storage facilities, witnesses changed their stories or refused to cooperate, and crucial leads were mysteriously abandoned or misdirected by unknown influences. The most disturbing development in the case was the gradual realization that someone with considerable power and resources was actively working to prevent the murders from being solved. Phone records vanished, forensic evidence was lost or contaminated, and potential witnesses found themselves subjected to intimidation or inducements to remain silent about what they had seen or heard. Detective Thomas documented these obstructions in his case files, creating a parallel investigation into the forces that seemed determined to keep the truth about the Sharp family murders from emerging. His notes revealed a pattern of interference that suggested coordination and planning at levels that exceeded the capabilities of ordinary criminals or local corruption. The detective's investigation into the obstruction of justice revealed connections between local officials, criminal organizations, and business interests that had stakes in maintaining the secrets and silence that protected various illegal activities throughout the region. These connections created a network of mutual protection that made it extremely difficult for honest investigators to pursue leads or gather evidence. The case files also revealed that several key witnesses had been relocated or had simply disappeared entirely, removing crucial sources of information from the investigation. The timing and coordination of these disappearances suggested that someone with access to law enforcement information was providing advance warning to individuals who might pose threats to the cover-up. By 1982, nearly a year after the murders, Detective Thomas had compiled enough evidence to suggest that the Sharp family had been killed because of their knowledge of criminal activities operating in the Keddie area. However, his attempts to pursue this theory were blocked by superiors who claimed lack of evidence while simultaneously ensuring that evidence remained unavailable for analysis. The detective's frustration with the systematic obstruction of his investigation led him to begin keeping unofficial records of his findings, creating a hidden archive of evidence and theories that would prove crucial to future attempts to solve the case. These secret files documented not only the details of the murders themselves, but also the elaborate efforts to prevent their solution. The unofficial investigation revealed that the Sharp family murders were connected to a drug trafficking operation that had been using the isolated mountain communities as distribution points and safe houses for several years before the killings. The operation involved individuals with connections to organized crime families based in major California cities, bringing levels of violence and intimidation that the small mountain communities were unprepared to handle. The drug trafficking network had apparently viewed the Sharp family as a threat to their operations, either because of direct knowledge of their activities or because of relationships and connections that could have exposed their presence in the Keddie area. The decision to eliminate this perceived threat had been made at organizational levels that possessed both the resources to carry out the murders and the influence to prevent effective investigation afterward. Detective Thomas's hidden files also documented evidence that the missing Sharp family member had been taken alive and was being held somewhere within the broader criminal network. The detective believed that this individual possessed information that could expose the entire operation, making their continued survival both valuable and dangerous to the organizations involved. The search for the missing family member led Detective Thomas into investigations that extended throughout Northern California and into Nevada, following leads that connected the Keddie murders to criminal activities in major metropolitan areas. However, these investigations were consistently blocked or redirected by influences that the detective could not identify or counter effectively. The most promising lead in the search for the missing Sharp family member came from an informant who claimed knowledge of safe houses and detention facilities used by the drug trafficking network. However, when Detective Thomas attempted to follow up on this information, he found that the informant had disappeared and that his own investigation was being monitored and obstructed by unknown parties. The realization that his investigation was being monitored forced Detective Thomas to operate in secret, using unofficial methods and personal resources to pursue leads that might otherwise be compromised by leaks within law enforcement agencies. This clandestine approach limited his effectiveness, but also provided some protection for sources and evidence that might otherwise have been eliminated. The detective's secret investigation revealed that the Sharp family murders had been witnessed by individuals who were too terrified to come forward officially, but who had provided fragments of information through indirect channels. These witnesses described seeing multiple perpetrators who appeared to be working according to a coordinated plan, supporting the theory that the murders had been carried out by an organized criminal group rather than local individuals acting spontaneously. The witness accounts also suggested that the attack on the Sharp family had been more extensive than the crime scene evidence indicated, with activities occurring both before and after the main events that had been carefully concealed or eliminated from the physical evidence. These additional activities appeared to involve searches of the cabin and removal of items or materials that the perpetrators considered important to their interests. Dr. Warren's continued analysis of the forensic evidence revealed additional details that supported the theory of organized criminal involvement. The weapons used in the attack, the methods employed to control and silence the victims, and the systematic cleanup of certain types of evidence all indicated professional criminal experience rather than the spontaneous violence typical of personal disputes. The pathologist's findings also suggested that the perpetrators had possessed medical or anatomical knowledge that enabled them to inflict maximum suffering while maintaining their victims' consciousness and ability to provide information. This specialized knowledge pointed to individuals with either medical training or extensive experience in torture and interrogation techniques. The investigation into the professional aspects of the murders led Detective Thomas to examine connections between the Keddie area and organized crime groups known to employ such techniques. His research revealed that several criminal organizations had been expanding their operations into rural areas during the late 1970s and early 1980s, using the isolation and limited law enforcement presence to establish new territories for drug trafficking and other illegal activities. The expansion of organized crime into rural areas had brought urban levels of violence and sophistication to communities that were unprepared to deal with such threats. Local law enforcement agencies lacked the training, resources, and experience necessary to investigate crimes committed by professional criminals who understood how to exploit the weaknesses of small-town justice systems. The Sharp family murders represented a perfect example of how organized criminals could eliminate perceived threats while using their superior resources and connections to prevent effective investigation and prosecution. The case demonstrated the vulnerability of isolated communities to predators who understood how to manipulate both legal systems and social dynamics to achieve their goals. Detective Thomas's analysis of the broader implications of the case revealed that the Sharp family murders were likely just one example of criminal activities that had been occurring throughout rural California during this period. The detective suspected that other unexplained disappearances and unsolved crimes in similar communities might be connected to the same criminal networks that had operated in Keddie. The realization that the Sharp family case might be part of a larger pattern of criminal activity prompted Detective Thomas to reach out to law enforcement agencies in other jurisdictions, seeking information about similar cases that might provide additional evidence or leads. However, these efforts were consistently frustrated by lack of cooperation and apparent coordination between various agencies to limit information sharing. The systematic obstruction of interagency cooperation suggested that the criminal networks involved in the Sharp family murders possessed influence and connections that extended throughout multiple levels of law enforcement and government. The scope of this influence made it virtually impossible for individual investigators to pursue leads that might expose the broader criminal enterprises. By 1985, 4 years after the murders, Detective Thomas had accumulated enough unofficial evidence to support a comprehensive theory about what had happened to the Sharp family and why the case had never been officially solved. However, his attempts to present this evidence to superiors and prosecutors were met with indifference, hostility, or claims that the evidence was insufficient or inadmissible. The rejection of his investigative work led Detective Thomas to realize that the obstruction of the case was not simply a matter of incompetence or resource limitations, but represented a deliberate effort to prevent the truth from emerging. The detective began to understand that his continued investigation was placing him in personal danger from the same forces that had eliminated the Sharp family and other witnesses. The decision to continue investigating despite personal risk reflected Detective Thomas's commitment to justice for the Sharp family and his understanding that failure to solve this case would encourage similar crimes against other vulnerable families. The detective's personal integrity and professional ethics drove him to persist even when institutional support had been withdrawn and obstacles had been systematically placed in his path. The detective's unofficial investigation continued for several more years, during which time he accumulated additional evidence and developed new leads that supported his theories about the criminal networks involved in the murders. However, his efforts to interest prosecutors in pursuing the case were consistently unsuccessful, with various excuses being offered for why charges could not be filed despite the availability of evidence. The failure of the official justice system to address the Sharp family murders created a situation where the truth remained hidden while the perpetrators remained free to continue their criminal activities. The case became a symbol of the limitations of law enforcement when confronted by organized criminal enterprises with sufficient resources and influence to manipulate the system from within. Detective Thomas's final report on the case, completed in 1990, documented nearly a decade of investigation that had revealed extensive evidence of criminal conspiracy, official corruption, and systematic obstruction of justice. The report identified specific individuals who should have been prosecuted and outlined the criminal networks that had operated with impunity throughout the region during the 1980s. However, the detective's comprehensive report was classified and sealed by authorities who claimed that its contents posed threats to ongoing investigations and national security interests. The classification of the report effectively removed it from public scrutiny and prevented other investigators from building upon the evidence that Detective Thomas had accumulated over years of dedicated work. The sealing of the investigation files marked the official end of efforts to solve the Sharp family murders, though the case continued to haunt those who had been involved in the investigation and the community members who had lived through the terror and uncertainty of the unsolved crimes. The failure to achieve justice created lasting trauma that affected not only the surviving family members, but also the broader community of Keddie. The psychological impact of the unsolved murders on the Keddie community was profound and lasting, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that persisted for decades after the original crimes. Residents lived with the knowledge that dangerous individuals had killed a family and remained free, possibly still living among them or capable of returning at any time to eliminate witnesses or commit additional crimes. The community's trust in law enforcement and the justice system was permanently damaged by the obvious failure to solve such a significant crime and protect the residents from ongoing threats. The sense of vulnerability and abandonment that resulted from this failure contributed to the gradual dissolution of the community as families moved away seeking safety and peace of mind elsewhere. Modern attempts to reopen the Sharp family murder case have encountered many of the same obstacles that frustrated the original investigation, suggesting that the forces responsible for obstructing justice in the 1980s may still possess influence and resources sufficient to prevent resolution of the case. Cold case investigators have found that crucial evidence remains missing or inaccessible, and potential witnesses continue to be reluctant to provide information. The persistence of obstruction decades after the original crimes indicates that the criminal networks involved in the murders may have evolved and adapted rather than disappeared, maintaining their interest in preventing exposure of their activities during the 1980s. The continued secrecy surrounding the case suggests that powerful interests remain committed to keeping the truth about the Sharp family murders from emerging. Contemporary investigators have applied modern forensic techniques to the limited evidence that remains available, revealing additional details about the crimes while also confirming many of Detective Thomas's original theories. The modern analysis has provided scientific validation for conclusions that were based primarily on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony in the original investigation. However, the application of modern investigative techniques has also revealed the extent to which crucial evidence was systematically destroyed or removed from the case files, making it impossible to pursue many leads that might have resulted in prosecutions. The destruction of evidence appears to have been deliberate and comprehensive, suggesting coordination and planning that extended over many years. The ongoing mystery of the Sharp family murders has attracted attention from independent researchers, journalists, and amateur investigators who have attempted to uncover information that official investigations have failed to discover. These unofficial efforts have revealed additional evidence and witness accounts that support the theory of organized criminal involvement, but have also encountered many of the same obstacles that frustrated the original investigation. The persistence of the Sharp family murder case as an unsolved mystery reflects broader issues about the limitations of justice systems when confronted by criminal organizations with superior resources and systemic influence. The case serves as an example of how organized crime can exploit weaknesses in law enforcement and legal institutions to avoid accountability for even the most serious crimes. In the quiet darkness of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where the wind still whispers through towering pines and empty lots mark the places where families once sought refuge and peace, the memory of the Sharp family serves as an eternal reminder that some secrets are too dangerous to tell and some truths are too powerful to be allowed to emerge. The Keddie cabin murders remain America's darkest family mystery, not because evidence of the perpetrators' identities is lacking, but because forces more powerful than justice continue to ensure that some stories remain forever buried in the shadows of towering trees that have seen everything but will never be allowed to tell what they know. The aftermath of the Sharp family murders created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy, transforming the small mountain community of Keddie into a place haunted by questions that would never be answered and fears that would never be laid to rest. The survivors of that terrible night carried with them not only the trauma of what they had witnessed, but also the burden of knowledge that made them potential targets for the same forces that had destroyed their family. The psychological impact on the surviving family members was profound and lasting, creating patterns of behavior and emotional responses that would influence their entire lives. The knowledge that their loved ones had been murdered by individuals who remained free and potentially dangerous created a constant state of hypervigilance and fear that affected every aspect of their daily existence. Dr. Sarah Hendricks, a trauma specialist who worked with the surviving Sharp family members in the years following the murders, documented the complex psychological effects of living with unresolved grief combined with ongoing fear of retaliation. Her clinical notes revealed that the survivors experienced symptoms that went beyond typical post-traumatic stress to include what she described as anticipatory terror, based on their understanding that the perpetrators remained at large and potentially aware of their continued existence. The therapeutic process was complicated by the survivors' knowledge that speaking openly about their experiences could place them in additional danger from the same individuals who had committed the original crimes. This created a paradoxical situation where healing required disclosure and processing of traumatic memories, while survival seemed to depend on silence and concealment. Dr. Hendricks observed that the survivors developed sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms designed to compartmentalize their knowledge and emotions while maintaining functional relationships with the outside world. These mechanisms enabled them to appear normal to casual observers while internally managing levels of fear and hypervigilance that would have been debilitating for individuals without their particular combination of trauma and survival instincts. The clinical documentation of the survivors' psychological adaptation revealed patterns that were consistent with individuals living under witness protection programs or in other situations where ongoing threats required constant vigilance and behavioral modification. The survivors had essentially been forced to create new identities and life patterns that would protect them from detection by their families' killers. The broader impact of the unsolved murders on the Keddie community was equally profound, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that affected every aspect of social interaction and community life. Residents found themselves questioning their neighbors, re-evaluating relationships, and constantly wondering whether the individuals responsible for the Sharp family deaths were still living among them. The community's collective trauma was exacerbated by the obvious failure of law enforcement to provide protection or justice, creating a sense of abandonment and vulnerability that undermined the social bonds that had previously held the small mountain settlement together. The knowledge that multiple murders could occur without resolution or accountability created a crisis of confidence in institutions and social structures that extended far beyond simple disappointment with police performance. Local business owners reported significant declines in tourism and new residents during the years following the murders, as word spread throughout the region that Keddie was an unsafe place where violence could occur without consequence. The economic impact of this reputation damage was particularly devastating for a community that relied heavily on outsiders for economic survival. The psychological effects on community members included increased rates of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse as residents struggled to cope with the ongoing stress of living in a place associated with unsolved violence. Many families eventually chose to relocate, rather than continue living with the constant reminders and uncertainties that the murders had created. The investigation into the community's collective response to the murders revealed that residents had developed informal networks of mutual protection and information sharing designed to compensate for the perceived failure of official law enforcement. These networks operated according to unwritten rules and communication systems that enabled community members to share warnings and suspicions without creating official records that might be accessed by hostile parties. The development of these parallel social structures reflected the community's understanding that they could not rely on external authorities for protection and had to create their own systems for identifying and responding to threats. The effectiveness of these informal networks varied, but their existence demonstrated the community's adaptation to living with ongoing danger and uncertainty. Detective Thomas's continued unofficial investigation revealed that the community's informal intelligence networks had identified several individuals as potential suspects or persons of interest in the Sharp family murders. However, the residents' reluctance to share this information with official investigators reflected their lack of confidence in law enforcement's ability to provide protection or achieve justice. The detectives' analysis of community dynamics revealed that the murders had created a permanent division between those residents who possessed potentially dangerous knowledge about the crimes and those who had been successfully isolated from such information. This division affected social relationships and community cohesion in ways that persisted for decades after the original tragedy. The long-term investigation also revealed that several key witnesses and community members had disappeared or relocated under mysterious circumstances during the years following the murders. The pattern of these disappearances suggested that someone was systematically eliminating individuals who might pose threats to the continued concealment of the truth about the Sharp family case. The disappearances were typically explained through conventional reasons such as job changes, family obligations, or personal preferences for different living situations. However, the timing and circumstances of many relocations raised questions about whether these individuals had left voluntarily or had been encouraged or coerced to disappear by parties interested in maintaining secrecy about the murders. Detective Thomas documented several cases where individuals who had expressed willingness to provide information about the Sharp family murders subsequently changed their minds, refused to cooperate with investigators, or simply vanished from the community entirely. The pattern of these behavior changes suggested systematic intimidation or inducement that went far beyond the capabilities of ordinary criminal suspects. The detective's analysis of witness intimidation revealed sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques designed to discourage cooperation without creating obvious evidence of criminal obstruction. These techniques included economic pressure, social isolation, and subtle threats that were difficult to prove but highly effective in silencing potential witnesses. The investigation into witness intimidation also revealed that several individuals who had initially provided information to investigators later retracted their statements or claimed to have been mistaken about what they had observed. The consistency of these retractions suggested coordination and planning that indicated professional-level obstruction of justice. The systematic elimination of witness testimony created a situation where the physical evidence from the crime scene became increasingly important to any potential prosecution, making the disappearance and destruction of forensic materials even more significant to the overall obstruction of justice. The combination of missing witnesses and missing evidence created a nearly insurmountable barrier to achieving justice for the Sharp family. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a criminologist who studied the Sharp family case as part of his research into organized crime's influence on rural communities, identified patterns that were consistent with professional criminal organizations' methods for controlling information and preventing prosecution. His analysis revealed that the obstruction of the case exhibited characteristics that were typical of organized crime's approach to managing legal threats. The criminologist's research revealed that organized criminal groups had developed sophisticated strategies for preventing prosecution that went far beyond simple intimidation or corruption of individual officials. These strategies included systematic infiltration of law enforcement agencies, coordination with legitimate business interests, and long-term planning that could maintain control over criminal cases for decades. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis of the Sharp family case revealed evidence of all these sophisticated obstruction techniques, suggesting that the murders had been committed by or on behalf of criminal organizations with extensive resources and long-term planning capabilities. The level of obstruction observed in the case exceeded what would be expected from local criminals or even corrupt officials acting independently. The criminologist's research also revealed that the Sharp family murders occurred during a period when organized crime groups were expanding their operations into rural areas throughout the western United States. This expansion was motivated by the availability of isolated locations for drug manufacturing and distribution, combined with limited law enforcement presence that made detection and prosecution less likely. The expansion of organized crime into rural areas had brought urban levels of violence and sophistication to communities that lacked the resources and experience necessary to respond effectively. The Sharp family murders represented a perfect example of how professional criminals could eliminate perceived threats while using their superior resources to prevent effective investigation and prosecution. Dr. Rodriguez's research identified similar patterns of unsolved violence in other rural communities throughout California, Nevada, and Oregon during the same period, suggesting that the Sharp family case was part of a broader wave of criminal activity that had been systematically concealed from public awareness. The consistency of obstruction techniques across multiple cases indicated coordination at levels that exceeded local criminal capabilities. The identification of similar cases in other jurisdictions prompted attempts to coordinate investigations and share information between law enforcement agencies. However, these efforts encountered many of the same obstacles that had frustrated the original Sharp family investigation, suggesting that the criminal organizations involved possessed influence that extended across multiple jurisdictions and agencies. The failure of interagency coordination efforts revealed the extent to which organized criminal groups had infiltrated or corrupted law enforcement institutions throughout the region. The systematic blocking of information sharing and joint investigations indicated that the criminals possessed advanced knowledge of law enforcement plans and activities through sources within official agencies. The realization that law enforcement agencies themselves had been compromised created additional challenges for honest investigators who found themselves isolated and unable to trust their own colleagues and superiors. This isolation made it virtually impossible to conduct effective investigations or build cases that could withstand the systematic obstruction that characterized organized crime's defensive strategies. Detective Thomas's documentation of these systemic problems became increasingly important as evidence that the Sharp family murders were not simply unsolved due to lack of evidence or investigative competence, but had been deliberately prevented from resolution by forces that possessed superior resources and influence. The detectives' files provided a roadmap for understanding how organized crime could manipulate the justice system to achieve virtual immunity from prosecution. The detectives' analysis revealed that the criminal organizations involved in obstructing the Sharp family investigation had developed methods that were remarkably similar to techniques used by intelligence agencies and other governmental organizations. The sophistication of their operations suggested either direct involvement by individuals with government training or consultation with such individuals in developing their strategies. The possibility that government agencies or personnel were involved in obstructing the Sharp family investigation opened new areas of inquiry, but also created additional risks for investigators who might be challenging powerful institutional interests. The intersection of organized crime and government corruption created layers of protection that were extremely difficult for individual investigators to penetrate. The investigation into possible government involvement revealed connections between organized crime groups and various federal agencies that had been established during earlier periods, when such cooperation had been considered acceptable for national security purposes. These historical relationships had created networks of mutual obligation and protection that persisted long after the original justifications had disappeared. The discovery of these historical connections provided context for understanding why the Sharp family investigation had encountered such systematic and sophisticated obstruction. The criminal organizations involved were not simply local criminals, but were connected to networks that possessed institutional knowledge and resources derived from decades of cooperation with government agencies. The modern re-examination of the Sharp family case has benefited from Freedom of Information Act requests and declassified documents that have revealed previously unknown connections between organized crime groups and government agencies during the 1980s. These documents have provided confirmation for many of Detective Thomas's theories, while also revealing additional layers of complexity that had not been apparent during the original investigation. The declassified materials have revealed that several federal agencies were conducting operations in the Keddie area during the period when the Sharp family murders occurred. These operations were related to drug trafficking investigations and national security concerns that created opportunities for organized crime groups to exploit governmental resources and protection for their own purposes. The federal operations in the area had apparently created a complex environment where criminal organizations, law enforcement agencies, and intelligence services were operating with competing and sometimes conflicting objectives. The Sharp family murders may have occurred within this environment of competing interests, making resolution of the case a threat to multiple parties who preferred to maintain secrecy about their activities. The revelation of federal involvement in the area during the critical period has prompted renewed interest in the Sharp family case from congressional investigators and oversight committees. However, these official inquiries have encountered many of the same obstacles that frustrated the original investigation, suggesting that the interests responsible for the original obstruction retain influence and resources sufficient to prevent contemporary resolution. The ongoing classification of documents related to federal operations in the Keddie area during the 1980s indicates that government agencies continue to consider information about those activities to be sensitive enough to warrant secrecy decades after the events occurred. This continued classification suggests that revelation of the truth about the Sharp family murders might expose government activities or relationships that current officials prefer to keep hidden. The persistence of government secrecy surrounding events in the Keddie area has created a situation where the Sharp family murders cannot be fully investigated without challenging institutional interests that possess resources and influence far exceeding those available to ordinary criminal investigators. This imbalance of power has created a permanent barrier to achieving justice that may never be overcome through conventional legal processes. The modern understanding of the Sharp family case, as involving government corruption and institutional cover-up, has attracted attention from journalists, researchers, and activists who specialize in exposing official misconduct and abuse of power. However, these efforts have also encountered systematic obstruction that reflects the continued sensitivity of the information and relationships involved in the original crimes. The investigative journalism efforts have revealed additional evidence supporting the theory that the Sharp family murders were connected to larger criminal and governmental operations, but have also demonstrated the continuing power of the interests involved in the original cover-up to prevent full disclosure of the truth. The balance between public interest in justice and institutional interest in secrecy remains tilted towards secrecy decades after the original crimes. The Sharp family case has become a symbol of the limitations of justice systems when confronted by criminal organizations and institutional corruption that possess resources and influence sufficient to manipulate legal processes. The case demonstrates how systematic obstruction can prevent resolution of even the most serious crimes when the perpetrators understand how to exploit weaknesses in governmental and legal institutions. The educational value of the Sharp family case extends beyond its specific details to provide insights into the mechanisms through which organized crime and government corruption can interact to create virtual immunity from prosecution. The case serves as a cautionary example of how institutional failures can perpetuate injustice and enable continued criminal activity. The psychological impact of the unresolved case continues to affect not only the surviving family members and community residents, but also law enforcement personnel and other officials who were involved in the failed investigation. The knowledge that systematic corruption and obstruction prevented justice has created lasting trauma for individuals whose professional and personal identities were built around beliefs in the effectiveness of legal and governmental institutions. The broader cultural impact of the Sharp family case has contributed to public skepticism about government institutions and law enforcement agencies that extends far beyond the specific circumstances of the murders. The case has become part of a broader narrative about institutional corruption and abuse of power that influences public attitudes toward authority and justice. Contemporary efforts to solve the Sharp family murders continue to encounter obstacles that demonstrate the persistence of the interests and relationships that originally prevented resolution of the case. The survival of these obstructive forces decades after the original crimes suggests that they have adapted and evolved rather than disappeared, maintaining their commitment to preventing exposure of their activities during the 1980s. The technological advances that have enabled modern cold case investigations have provided new tools for analyzing the Sharp family evidence, but have also revealed the extent to which crucial materials were systematically destroyed or removed from official files. The destruction of evidence appears to have been so comprehensive and deliberate that it may have permanently eliminated the possibility of conventional prosecution. However, the same technological advances that have revealed the extent of evidence destruction have also created new opportunities for investigation and analysis that may eventually overcome the obstacles that have protected the perpetrators for so many years. Modern investigative techniques may be capable of extracting information from sources and materials that were not available to investigators during the 1980s. The ongoing evolution of forensic science and investigative technology maintains hope that the Sharp family murders may eventually be solved despite decades of systematic obstruction. The persistence of investigators, journalists, and researchers who refuse to accept the permanent concealment of the truth provides continuing pressure for resolution that may eventually overcome even the most sophisticated obstruction. The legacy of the Sharp family case serves as both a warning about the dangers of institutional corruption and a reminder of the importance of persistent efforts to achieve justice even when faced with overwhelming obstacles. The case demonstrates that truth and justice may be delayed by powerful interests, but the human desire for accountability and resolution ensures that efforts to uncover the truth will continue regardless of the time that passes or the obstacles that are placed in the path of investigation. In the eternal silence of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where towering pines stand as silent witnesses to secrets that powerful forces have tried to bury, the memory of the Sharp family continues to demand justice that has been denied for more than 4 decades. Their story remains hidden, not because the truth is unknowable, but because those who possess the truth understand that its revelation would expose networks of corruption and criminal activity that extend far beyond a single family's tragedy to challenge the foundations of institutional power and governmental authority that some consider too important to sacrifice for the sake of justice. The academic study of the Sharp family case has evolved significantly over the decades since the original murders, with researchers from multiple disciplines contributing to a growing body of analysis that examines the case from psychological, sociological, criminological, and political perspectives. This scholarly attention has helped preserve important details and insights that might otherwise have been lost as witnesses aged and physical evidence deteriorated or disappeared. Professor Janet Morrison of the University of California's Criminal Justice Department has conducted extensive research into the Sharp family case as part of her broader study of how organized crime groups interact with governmental institutions to avoid prosecution. Her work has revealed patterns and connections that were not apparent to contemporary investigators, providing new theoretical frameworks for understanding how systematic obstruction of justice operates at institutional levels. Professor Morrison's research methodology has involved analysis of declassified documents, interviews with retired law enforcement personnel, and comparison with similar cases throughout the United States during the 1980s and 1990s. Her findings have revealed that the Sharp family case was part of a broader pattern of institutional failure and corruption that affected numerous investigations during that period. The professor's analysis has identified specific techniques and strategies that were consistently employed across multiple cases to prevent prosecution of organized crime activities. These techniques included infiltration of law enforcement agencies, corruption of judicial personnel, systematic destruction of evidence, intimidation of witnesses, and coordination with legitimate business and political interests to create protective environments for criminal operations. The consistency of these obstruction techniques across different jurisdictions and time periods has led Professor Morrison to conclude that organized crime groups had developed standardized procedures for managing legal threats that were based on extensive study of law enforcement capabilities and weaknesses. The sophistication of these procedures exceeded what would be expected from purely criminal organizations and suggested coordination with individuals possessing governmental or institutional knowledge and resources. Professor Morrison's research has also revealed that the Sharp family murders occurred during a period when federal agencies were conducting various covert operations that created opportunities for criminal organizations to exploit governmental resources and protection for their own purposes. The intersection of legitimate governmental activities and criminal enterprises created complex environments where traditional law enforcement approaches were inadequate or counterproductive. The professor's findings have contributed to broader academic discussions about the relationship between organized crime and governmental institutions in democratic societies. Her work has demonstrated that the assumption of clear boundaries between criminal and legitimate activities may be naive when dealing with sophisticated criminal organizations that understand how to manipulate institutional structures and processes. The educational impact of Professor Morrison's research has extended throughout criminal justice programs in universities across the United States, providing students with realistic understanding of the challenges that honest law enforcement personnel face when confronting systematic corruption and obstruction. Her work has helped prepare a new generation of investigators and prosecutors for the complex realities of investigating organized crime in environments where institutional support cannot be assumed. The international scholarly attention that Professor Morrison's work has attracted has created opportunities for comparative analysis of similar cases in other countries, revealing that the patterns observed in the Sharp family case are not unique to the United States, but represent broader challenges faced by democratic institutions when confronting sophisticated criminal organizations with extensive resources and political connections. The comparative international analysis has revealed that organized crime groups throughout the world have developed similar strategies for avoiding prosecution through systematic corruption and manipulation of legal systems. The universality of these strategies suggests that they represent fundamental weaknesses in democratic institutions that require systematic attention and reform rather than case-by-case responses. Dr. Robert Chen, a forensic psychologist who has studied the psychological impact of unresolved trauma on communities, has conducted extensive research into the long-term effects of the Sharp family murders on the residents of Keddie and surrounding areas. His work has revealed that the community trauma created by the unsolved murders has had lasting effects that continue to influence social relationships and community dynamics more than 4 decades after the original crimes. Dr. Chen's research has documented how the failure to achieve justice for the Sharp family has created what he terms institutional trauma that extends beyond the direct victims to affect entire communities' trust in legal and governmental systems. This institutional trauma has created lasting changes in social behavior and community organization that persist long after the original triggering events. The psychological analysis has revealed that communities affected by unresolved violent crimes develop collective coping mechanisms that include increased suspicion of outsiders, heightened security awareness, and informal networks of mutual protection and information sharing. These adaptations serve protective functions, but also create social costs in terms of reduced openness, decreased community cohesion, and persistent anxiety about potential threats. Dr. Chen's work has also examined how the failure of official institutions to provide protection and justice affects individual psychological development, particularly for young people who grow up in environments where institutional failure is a defining characteristic of their social reality. His research has revealed that exposure to systematic institutional failure during formative years can create lasting patterns of cynicism, hypervigilance, and difficulty trusting authority figures. The therapeutic implications of Dr. Chen's research have influenced the development of new treatment approaches for individuals and communities affected by institutional trauma. These approaches recognize that healing from trauma caused by institutional failure requires not only individual therapy, but also community-level interventions that address collective trauma and rebuild trust in social institutions. The research into community trauma has also revealed that the effects of unresolved violent crimes extend far beyond the immediate geographic area where they occurred, affecting broader regional and even national perceptions of safety and institutional effectiveness. The Sharp family case has become part of a broader narrative about institutional failure that influences public attitudes toward law enforcement and governmental authority throughout the United States. Contemporary investigative efforts have benefited from advances in digital forensics and data analysis that have enabled researchers to identify connections and patterns that were invisible to investigators in the 1980s. These modern analytical techniques have revealed additional evidence supporting the theory that the Sharp family murders were connected to larger criminal networks, while also confirming the systematic nature of the obstruction that prevented their resolution. Digital forensics specialists have applied modern analytical techniques to preserve documents and evidence from the original investigation, revealing previously undetected alterations, deletions, and manipulations that provide evidence of systematic tampering with the official record. These discoveries have confirmed many of the suspicions that Detective Thomas and other honest investigators had developed during their attempts to solve the case. The digital analysis has also revealed patterns of communication and coordination between various parties involved in obstructing the investigation that were not apparent to contemporary investigators who lacked access to modern analytical tools. These patterns provide evidence of the systematic and coordinated nature of the obstruction, while also revealing the extent of the criminal networks involved in the cover-up. Modern genetic analysis techniques have been applied to preserved biological evidence from the Sharp family crime scene, revealing additional details about the perpetrators, while also confirming that crucial genetic evidence was systematically removed or destroyed during the original investigation. The patterns of evidence destruction appear to have been targeted specifically at materials that would have enabled identification of the perpetrators. The genetic analysis has also revealed evidence that supports Detective Thomas's theory that the murders were committed by multiple perpetrators working in coordination rather than by individuals acting spontaneously or independently. The biological evidence indicates a level of planning and organization that is consistent with professional criminal activity rather than personal disputes or random violence. Contemporary investigative journalism has played a crucial role in maintaining public attention on the Sharp family case and in uncovering additional evidence that was not available to the original investigators. Journalists have used Freedom of Information Act requests, interviews with retired personnel, and analysis of declassified documents to reveal connections and patterns that confirm many of the theories developed by honest investigators during the 1980s. The journalistic investigation has also revealed the extent to which news coverage of the original case was managed and manipulated by parties interested in preventing public understanding of the true circumstances surrounding the murders. The systematic control of information flow to the media appears to have been part of the broader strategy for preventing resolution of the case. Modern investigative journalism has benefited from digital communication technologies that enable secure communication between sources and reporters, making it more difficult for parties interested in maintaining secrecy to monitor and control information flow. These technological advances have enabled journalists to pursue leads and develop sources that would have been too dangerous to contact using traditional communication methods. However, contemporary investigative efforts have also encountered new forms of obstruction and interference that reflect the evolution of the interests and organizations involved in the original cover-up. These modern obstruction techniques include cyber attacks, legal intimidation, economic pressure, and sophisticated disinformation campaigns designed to discredit investigative efforts and maintain public confusion about the facts of the case. The persistence of systematic obstruction, more than 4 decades after the original murders, indicates that the criminal networks and institutional interests involved in the Sharp family cover-up have not only survived, but have adapted and evolved to meet new challenges to their secrecy. The sophistication of contemporary obstruction techniques suggests that these networks possess resources and capabilities that have grown rather than diminished over time. The ongoing evolution of obstruction techniques has created an arms race between investigators seeking truth and organizations committed to maintaining secrecy, with each side developing new capabilities and strategies to counter the other's advances. This dynamic competition has made the Sharp family case a testing ground for both investigative techniques and counter-investigation strategies that have implications extending far beyond the specific circumstances of the original murders. The technological documentation and preservation of evidence and analysis related to the Sharp family case has created comprehensive digital archives that will enable future researchers to apply new analytical techniques as they are developed. These archives represent a significant resource for understanding not only the specific details of the case, but also the broader patterns of institutional corruption and criminal activity that characterize the period. The digital preservation efforts have also created permanent records of the investigative process itself, documenting how honest investigators and researchers have pursued truth despite systematic obstruction and interference. These records provide valuable insights into the methods and strategies that are most effective for overcoming institutional resistance to accountability and justice. The educational value of the comprehensive documentation extends beyond criminal justice and law enforcement to provide insights into political science, sociology, psychology, and other disciplines that study how power operates in democratic societies. The Sharp family case has become a multidisciplinary resource for understanding the complex relationships between crime, corruption, and institutional power. The ongoing research and investigation efforts have created a community of scholars, journalists, investigators, and activists who are committed to achieving justice for the Sharp family, while also exposing the broader patterns of corruption and institutional failure that the case represents. This community has developed informal networks of communication and cooperation that enable coordination of efforts while maintaining security against continued obstruction and interference. The collaborative approach that has evolved around the Sharp family case represents a new model for investigating complex criminal and political cases where traditional law enforcement approaches have proven inadequate. The combination of academic research, investigative journalism, legal advocacy, and grassroots activism has created capabilities that exceed what any single investigative approach could achieve independently. The cultural impact of the ongoing efforts to achieve justice for the Sharp family has extended throughout American popular culture, inspiring books, documentaries, podcasts, and other media productions that have helped maintain public awareness of the case, while also highlighting broader issues of institutional corruption and criminal impunity. The ethical considerations involved in continued investigation and public discussion of the Sharp family case include responsibilities to the surviving family members, respect for the victim's memory, and concern for the potential impact of continued publicity on ongoing investigative efforts. These ethical dimensions require ongoing attention and discussion among all parties involved in pursuing justice for the family. In the vast wilderness of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where ancient trees stand as eternal sentinels over secrets that powerful forces continue to guard, the legacy of the Sharp family represents far more than a single unsolved criminal case. Their story has become a symbol of the ongoing struggle between truth and secrecy, between justice and institutional power, between the demands of human conscience and the calculations of political expediency that define the eternal tension at the heart of democratic society, reminding us that some battles for justice transcend individual cases to become defining moments in the broader struggle for accountability, transparency, and human dignity that determines whether democratic institutions serve the people they claim to protect or the powerful interests that seek to manipulate them for their own purposes.